Hello everybody, let's talk about Pennsylvania. So first up, my sources. You'll notice in part 1, I only had one book source. Yes, that's really bad practice. I'm sorry about that. I even talked about that in the Ford discussion video. I'm sorry. What happened was I wanted to get this out by the 4th of July, and I found that source, I started reading it, and it had a lot of details. It covered everything pretty well. It even talked about a lot of the stuff that went on in the Swedish colony. But then I started reading, and I noticed partway through that it was 600 pages long. So it's like, well, there goes my time to read other things. But despite the fact that it was only one source, from what I saw, everything looked pretty accurate. I only suspect a little bit of historical bias. I'll let you know when that comes in. For part 2, it's a little better because I had read some things about this time before I started this YouTube channel. And those were Ben Franklin's autobiography and another book source that specifically talked about the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution and those events, as well as a general idea of people's attitudes leading up to it. Now, corrections, I have one or two. First up, in the first video, I said that the East India Company were the ones that started New Amsterdam in the place where New York is now. It was actually the Dutch West India Company. I got East and West mixed up. Actually, my source said it was East India, but one of the commenters on the video said it was West India Company, and I double-checked it, and it was West India. Also, the name of the tribe from the Lenape's oral history, most people commonly accept it as Allegheny with a T in front of it, but people looked at it and traced the linguistic origins, and they determined it was probably actually Allegheny. So I used Allegheny to try and be more accurate to the time. Also, when I talk about Pennsylvania's colonial government, I kind of simplified the structure of how it works. There's actually an assembly and a council, which are two different things, but whenever I mentioned it, I kind of simplified it to just the assembly. Now, let's talk about Native American tribes. There's two things that I wanted to bring up. First up is the Eary Tribe. As of the time that my source was written, nobody knew much anything about them. People speculated that they could have been genetically related to the Algonquins, which are the same family that the Lenape came from. Also, they could have been related to the Iroquois, or they could have been related to someone out west. The second thing I wanted to bring up was the Allegheny. The Lenape and the stories describe them as giants. And I kind of made the connection to the Susquehannocks because descriptions of that tribe describe them as being pretty tall. So this isn't anyone else's speculation that I read anywhere. This is more just my own speculation. Maybe those tribes could have been related. I'm not sure. I also wanted to point out that the source I got most of my information from was written in 1903. So I'm almost certain that sometime in the past 115 years, someone else has looked at one of these two questions and maybe figured out an answer to it. If I had more time, those are some of the things I would have looked further into to kind of nerd out, so if you want to look into those yourselves and maybe comment if you find anything, that would be pretty cool. Another thing I thought was pretty cool, I just wanted to mention, is a lot of descriptions of Native Americans I've seen describe them as having this, like, connection with nature, like they're more in touch with their surroundings when they're outdoors than people who grew up surrounded by towns, cities, other people. One of the descriptions of the Lenape I read said that they have this idea of when animals are moving around in the woods that most people would be oblivious to. I also saw one about one of the tribes in the Midwest that said they knew when it was about to rain because they could feel sort of a tingling in their nose. I wanted to mention and be impressed by all the effort that went into making a colony in the New World. To be one of the first people over here building a town from scratch, that's a pretty impressive thing. Making, like, forts, farms, establishing trade with the native tribes. That sounds like a really cool adventure. But at the same time, I'm not sure I would want to live life that rugged for that long. I'm also wondering if they could have even done it without the generosity of the natives, giving them food when they were about to starve and such. Happy early Thanksgiving. Names for tribes. Say hi to the camera. A lot of times there's more than one name for tribes. For example, I've been calling them Susquehannocks throughout the videos, but I've also seen them referred to as the Minquas. Also the Iroquois, or the Six Nations, or the Five Nations, depending on when. They're called the Five Nations or the Six Nations because they are made up of 5 different tribes, which are the Seneca, the Mohawks, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and one more, I forget. And then there was another one around, yeah. Also, it's kind of funny, in the beginning they introduced them as the Lenape and said they're also called the Delaware, and then mostly referred to them as the Lenape, but then towards the second half, when all the wars were happening, they called them the Delaware, like they didn't want to admit that the Lenape got pushed west and were so angry about how unfair they were being treated that they joined 3 or 4 wars against the Pennsylvanians. I think I kind of got a bit of a biased view of the one sitting governor, the guy named Evans. I looked him up online, and I couldn't find much more than what the book said about him. And the book kind of highlighted his more crazy ideas, like putting a toll on the Delaware and riding someone through Philly saying they were under attack. I think his trick of having that guy ride through Philly kind of cemented his place in history, because there's not really much other information I could find about him, and I feel like the information that is out there doesn't give him a fair shake. I wanted to bring up the use of boycotts as a political weapon in American politics. All throughout history, even since the Stamp Act, Americans have been going after the revenue source of companies that they politically disagree with. During the Revolution, there were groups of people in Boston, New York, Philly organizing community boycotts of British goods in protest of the Stamp Act. And even today, especially today in 2016, 2017, there's been a lot of boycotting going on. If anyone's familiar with Fox News, Bill O'Reilly got accused of sexual harassment in the workplace, and people who disagree with the way that Fox News frames their news stories took that opportunity to contact the companies that advertised during Bill O'Reilly's hour and encourage them to drop the ads or face a potential boycott. Also, CNN, Kathy Griffin, same idea. She did a photo shoot that included a picture of her holding a bloody Donald Trump head, and people who disagree with CNN's reporting took the opportunity, called up Kathy Griffin's advertisers, and same as Bill O'Reilly, she got fired from CNN because the advertisers kept dropping her, and CNN wasn't making enough money from advertisers off her program. If anyone's heard of YouTube Adpocalypse but doesn't understand what happened, it's kind of the same idea, where companies don't want their brand names associated with certain YouTube channels. Mostly channels that talk about news and politics, but other channels as well. So a lot of YouTube videos have been getting demonetized, and a lot of companies have decided it's just not worth it to advertise on YouTube because of the potential for a boycott. So American political boycotts have been a massive headache for companies since 1765. Sorry, not sorry. I also wanted to bring up slavery since it didn't find a convenient spot in the main series video. In Pennsylvania, there seems to be, in the colonial time at least, there seems to be a pretty even split between slavery and indentured servitude. Now, the difference is, with slavery, the worker, is the legal property of the slave owner. However, with indentured servitude, the worker is technically a free person. What happens is they start in Europe, and they need a way to get over to America because they want to live in the New World. So they find a wealthy landowner who's already there, and they agree that the landowner pays for their passage, pays for their ship ride over, and in exchange they have to work the landowner's farm for a certain amount of years that they agree upon. So in the colonial period, there seems to be, from what I've read at least, there seems to be a pretty even split between those two sources of labor. However, slavery was abolished in Pennsylvania in the year 1780. They passed a bill that did that. However, it didn't abolish slavery right away. What it did was outlaw the buying of new slaves, and people who were slaves at the time that the bill was passed, they had to wait a certain number of years before becoming free. The reason being, if a slave owner bought a slave like a week before the bill passed, and then only had them for that 1 week, that wouldn't be their money's worth. I also wanted to bring attention to, most people today seem to be in favor of the revolution because our country would not exist without it. But people at the time had far more divided opinions over this, and I feel like we sort of gloss over a lot of those, especially the loyalist mindset. I'll use Brexit as an example. People's opinions over Brexit are far from unified. But as it goes down in history, people will learn the most about the opinions of those who voted leave. So I just wanted to give special mention to there were people in the colony that thought the British taxes were fair. There were people in the colony who wanted to remain part of Britain and try to fix the colony's relationship with the mother country. Maybe rethink some of the taxes, maybe get some seats in Parliament for the colonies. And of course, as we know, there were people who wanted to overturn the whole system. And of course, even among Leave voters, there's a lot of disagreement about how to go about it. And even among colonial revolutionaries, there was a ton of disagreement about how to go about it, what kind of government they wanted to establish to put in the place of that they were overthrowing. One of the quotes I keep, it's from a guy named James Cannon. He's talking about who they should choose to send to the Constitutional Convention. Let no man represent you who would be disposed to form any rank above that of free man. I like this one because it illustrates the uncertainty of what was going to happen, despite how eager people were to overthrow the king. They didn't know what kind of government was going to replace it. A lot of people, most people in fact, knew that they didn't want another monarchy because they didn't want all the power centralized in one place. They didn't want a repeat of the government they were overthrowing. But when they look back on history for examples of what kind of government they should put in its place, the idea of kings having a divine right from God to rule the country was not such an outdated idea. Another one of my quotes, I think this is a good one to end on, it's from Thomas Wharton Jr. So this is the guy that was elected to be president of the Executive Committee of Pennsylvania. The first president of the Executive Committee took office in 1777. I feel myself very inadequate to the station I am in, but some that were fit for it have either withdrawn themselves entirely or are opposing the government. However, as it is in the power of every man to act with integrity and uprightness, he that does that will at least have the approbation of his own conscience and merit that of the public. So that's what I got for you today. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'm eager to make more. Stay cool, guys!